Hello and welcome to another bearing video featuring Boca bearings. Today I am going to be removing and installing a set of bearings in a customer engine of mine. Today's engine is an OS 160 FX two-stroke engine. So it's a rather large engine. It's a really well-used engine. Let's get right to the table and do this removal and installation using Boca bearings. Okay, so here on the table I've got my crankcase with crankshaft and bearings still installed in this OS 160 FX engine. This is just a really large engine. Now I've already got some oil inside here soaking a little bit so we can help loosen up these bearings. I've got some tools here and quite a variety of different tools this time because of the fact that I'm doing a used engine, a customer engine. You never know what all you might need, how stubborn some bearings might be. So my standard tools are this piece of wood and a little light hammer. I've also got a punch, flat nose punch, a large dowel, and a couple of just flat blade screwdrivers. Just because when it comes to removing the rear bearing on certain engines or on any engine, you never know if the bearing, once the crankshaft comes out, if you're going to have a lip to catch and drive that bearing out. Sometimes it's flush and that can be really challenging to get out. So I've got a variety of things here. Not sure what we're going to encounter. I've also got my heat gun so I can heat this crankcase up considerably, and of course my protective glove. So with all of that said, let's go ahead and start heating this engine up, and we'll drive this crankshaft out first, and then we'll get to the bearings. Okay, so this engine crankcase is rather large and it's going to sink a lot of that heat, so I had to put it on there for a considerable amount of time in the hopes that we got enough. So the crankshaft's coming out. I have no idea at this point if the bearing is coming out with it. You never really know until you just go and look. Let's see here. Is the bearing coming out with this? It doesn't look like it is. There's our crankshaft, and no, the bearing did not come out with it, unfortunately. And it also doesn't really feel like there's much of a lip in there for me to grab on, so this is going to be an interesting rear bearing removal. But first, let's get this front bearing out. Now I'm going to attempt to use this dowel rod, and this is going to come out really easily because that bearing's almost out right now. So there's our front bearing is out. Now is where it's going to get interesting because I got to see if I can get any kind of a lip on this bearing here at all. There's not a whole lot going on there. I may have to just tap this a few times and see if I've got enough of a lip to get it moving at all. Use this punch, but this punch is pretty short. I can catch a lip a little bit here. I don't know if I'm going to be able to hold it on that lip or not, though. So I'm just seeing if I can get a lip just enough to start driving it down a little bit. I'm probably just going to have to really heat this up a lot more. screwdriver provides me another little bit of an edge here. The other means of removing this will be to get a block of wood and put it in this vise and really heat this thing up and just kind of slam it down and see if I can get the bearing to come out that way. That's not the preferred means of doing it. I prefer it if I had a lip in there that I could grab, but this particular design just doesn't have that. So I'm going to have to pause right here, get a nice piece of wood to put in there. This one's not going to be, this one might be big enough. Let's just put this in here, and it's probably going to require considerably more heat and maybe a little bit more oil. The kicker with this method of doing it is you really need to maintain. There's the methodology and there's the bearing right there. That was easy, easier than I thought. All right, so there you go. These are some of the things you may encounter when removing bearings on a used engine. This is rather hot, so I don't want to keep touching it. So like I said, you can have a situation where if you're looking at it from the front, that you can still catch a little bit of the lip of the inner race. In this situation, that was not the case at all. The crankcase filled that area up. I was hoping I could catch an edge and start to move it a little bit, but it just didn't work out that way. So the next thing would be a lot of heat, especially for an engine this size. Put it on a piece of wood, have a piece of wood to just tap the crankcase on, and then just do that, and then the bearing can come out also. So I'm going to clean this area up a little bit here, and then we'll do the bearing installation. Okay, so in between removal and now, I put the crankcase in the ultrasonic cleaner to get it all nice and cleaned up. I cleaned up the crankshaft and got it ready for the installation of the bearings. And you're going to see some different things on the table here as far as tools go. And the first thing you're going to see that's very different from what you've ever seen on my table before is a set of bearing pullers. And while the crankcase was being cleaned, I pulled out the main bearing for this, and I like to install the main bearing on the crankshaft and put that whole assembly in the crankshaft at once. So what I'll do is I'll put the front bearing in first, and then I'll put the rear bearing on the crankshaft and install it that way. That way it gives me a centering mechanism for installing the bearing, because this bearing's already in there and it'll allow me to center that, as opposed to just dropping a bearing in there, trying to find a socket large enough and hoping that you get it going in straight. This way always guarantees that you're going in straight. So in the break there, I took the main bearing out, and usually it's just a matter of very simply just lubricating up the inner race and the outside of this, and you just slide the bearing on. Well, for this particular engine, that is not the case at all. It was not willing to just slide on at all. So I was brainstorming, trying to figure out how I'm supposed to get this on here so that I could continue to install the bearing the way I normally like to do it. So that's when I pulled out my 3-jaw bearing puller, and I determined that I can actually use this to actually draw that bearing, very tight fitting bearing, onto this crankshaft. So that was a rather tedious process, so I'll probably show setting that up and parts of it, but there could be some editing done just because it's a rather tedious process, and I'll be standing that bearing puller up in this vise here and rotating it, because as you start to pull, so I'm going to grab the bearing all the way from the inner race and start drawing it down on the crankshaft, but once it gets to this part, then I have to readjust the jaws on the bearing puller and just catch the part of the inner race, because I can't have it completely covering it, otherwise it's not going to pull down over the crankshaft here. So I've got to have clearance, so I've got to sit there and readjust those jaws, and that can be rather tedious. So that's what you've got here. I've got my standard piece of wood for tapping in the front bearing, my light hammer for doing that. I've got a bottle of Boca's Lightning Lube Road Power and a jar here to use to re-oil all of this stuff. a small screwdriver because I'll be removing one of the metal shields on the front bearing. Now this kit bearings, this kit bearing assembly number is an ENK073, and both of these bearings came with metal shielded, non-removable metal shielded bearings on both sides. While I was messing around with installing or practicing installing this on there, I already removed the bearings or the shields on this bearing. I've got one shield here. I'm going to leave one side shielded, the side facing outside the engine, and then the other side open. So let's go ahead and I will open this package of bearings up, and I'll remove that one shield real quick, and then we'll get to the installation of this main bearing on the crankshaft. Looks like my little bag ripped here. There we go. Now this is really a pretty massive bearing, and of course they come pre-greased. Any sealed, shielded bearing is going to be greased from the factory. So let me move this out of the way. So in order for me to remove one of these non-removable, they're called non-removable shields, they're not intended to be removed, but yet they can be. I use just a really small precision screwdriver, and just above that there's a gap between the inner race and that shield. I just kind of push my screwdriver in there and then just start kind of pulling up on it, and you just very lightly get in there, and you can kind of either puncture a hole in that, or you just start pulling it up and it just comes right off as soon as you get underneath there. And that's all there is to it. Removing that shield. So like I said, I'm going to leave one shield on facing the outside of the engine. This will be facing the inboard side of the engine. But I think before I even install bearings, I think what I want to do is go ahead and fixture up this bearing puller. So what I'm going to do here is probably adjust this camera height just a little bit so you can see a little bit more. I was doing this by hand using a wrench on the end, but then I brainstormed, an idea came to me to just chuck it in here like this. So this thing is holding steady, and then I don't have to sit there and mess with too much. So I'm just going to put my crankshaft on the top here. I think you can see all that. I'm just going to, first of all, I think what I want to do is I want to lubricate these things up like I said I was going to do. I'm just going to use one squirt of this road power in here and lubricate this crankshaft, the inner and outer races. Outer race for going into the crankcase. I'll just get all the lubricating done here all at one time, so I don't have to worry about it anymore. And do it with the crankcase too. Okay, that's all lubricated up nice. So now let's get to the fun. Let's get to the fun part here of fixturing up this crankshaft. And of course it doesn't matter which side I put in or out of this because both sides are unshielded. So I'm just going to kind of set this on here, and this thing just does not want to lay on there at all. So I'm just going to bring my jaws up as close and encapsulate that whole inner race, so I'm not putting any stress on anything there at all. And I'm just going to start rotating this thing, and it should start drawing that on there. I gotta make sure we draw it on there evenly though, and have this crankshaft remember which way to go to. Okay, so we're drawing the bearing on right now. We're almost to that hub there. And now we're at the hub. Now I have to loosen it and readjust here. And this is where it gets a little tricky. I might actually just try using two jaws really tough. Like I said, I've never ever had to do this before. This is a completely new process. Now that it's down over that, I can re-grip solidly on the inner races, and it's still not wanting to just slide down on there. I thought I had it. Maybe it will want to slide down on there now because it doesn't seem like it's taking a whole lot of effort. Of course, now maybe I could just do this with a wrench. Just draw this bearing on all the way with the wrench now. Make it a lot easier. Alright, so now that our bearing is installed onto the crankshaft, now we can go back to our normal programming, which is including actually installing the bearings into the engine. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to heat this crankcase up again, lay this front bearing in here, and drive it into place. Let's see if that's enough to at least get this front bearing installed. Okay, front bearing's installed. Now the only thing I didn't think about is this crankshaft might be a little bit too long for me to get full engagement there. And we'll see. Not sure if that's warm enough. It should be good. Let's see here if this is warm enough to drive in place now. It needs to go a little bit more, it looks like. Do I have room to drive it anymore? Looks like I do have a little bit more room. Now I think I've reached the limit of my... Oh, now we're fully seated. I think I could go one more. Yeah, but now I am at the limit of that, so I'm going to have to prop... how am I going to do this? Get another piece of wood here. I'm going to have to prop the vise up here. So I've got more room to drive that last little bit home. Okay, now I've got that fully seated, and that wraps up the bearing installation for this customer OS 160 FX engine.